it's my pleasure to introduce Oliver Richmond. Now, Oliver Richmond, if you actually type Oliver Richmond in Amazon, apart from numerous references to the musical Oliver, you will find a long list of publications, and they include a post-liberal peace, liberal peace transition, peace in international relations, the transformation of peace, rethinking peace and conflict studies, and the journal, of course, Peace Building. Oliver is a peace scholar, you will have gathered. Now, his current research is actually moving on from his original interests, which were in the debates on agency, resistance, and hybridity. He's focusing on the relationship between peace processes, power, and the nature of progressive politics. And he's been rethinking the nature of peace in the 21st century. And he's also involved in unpacking the framework of power that determines modern peace. So starting from the concept of field. So he works with colleagues around here, especially Sandra Pagoda and Jasmine Ramovic. So he's also currently producing a volume cataloging understandings of peace from different academic disciplines. And he's the scientific coordinator of a very major grant, EU-funded grant, on cultures of governance and conflict resolution in India and Europe. Now, it's interesting because when you work in peace studies, of course, you usually have two aspects to your career. You have an intellectual career, which I have sketched very roughly, and you have also more a practice-oriented career, a career of involvement in the actual actions of peace work. And Oliver's work, your original field was Cyprus, and well, I believe you were asked whether a referendum was a good idea, and you said yes, by the United Nations. He's worked as well on other areas like Bosnia-Herzegovina, Kosovo, and Timor-Leste, from the perspective of locally formed organizations. Now, I think Oliver's work is very interesting from the point of view of the theoretical dimension he brings to peace studies, but also from his willingness to engage fundamentally with practical issues. And I think some of that comes across, notably in the creation of a little NGO, which you're hoping to set up. You're calling it, have you decided what to call it yet?
Well, I mean, the name we wanted is actually gone, so we couldn't call it. I mean, it's going to be called Professors Without Borders, but that's kind of taken by another organisation, which does something different. So we're still debating.
So something possibly without borders.
I mean, it's a cliche, but it gets the idea across.
Well, basically an international agit-prop organization
exactly, yeah.
Of academics, and partnering with conflict-affected countries in particular. Finally, and this is the most interesting feature, I must say, of your profile, is currently writing a book for teenagers, introducing them to peace. And I think that's probably the most challenging job you've ever undertaken. But tonight, you are engaging with peace formation and local infrastructures for peace. So please welcome Oliver Richmond.
Well, thanks so much, Bertrand, for a very gracious introduction. And before I begin, I'd like to just go through a few formalities. I mean, I'd like to thank colleagues present and past for their support. A lot of this work really isn't mine. It came from all kinds of conversations and connections and practical and theoretical debates that I've been involved in. Going really right back to my sort of early work with John Groom, who was sort of doyen of international relations and peace and conflict back in the 70s and the 80s, and then a range of other universities around the world. I'd particularly like to say thanks to my colleagues here at HCRI and at the University of Manchester also for providing a supportive and vibrant environment for doing more of this stuff. I should probably add a caveat. None of those people, some of whom are here, some of whom aren't, are to blame for what follows. I do my best. I'd like to say a particular kind of thanks to some of the people I met in my very early work on Cyprus, which Bertrand referred to, who really opened my eyes to the power relations that circulate within peace processes, within peace building, state building, peacekeeping, and so forth. I mean, it's taken me 20 odd years to realize that they opened my eyes to it because it's only just really hit me. But I think that's where it all began. I I think this is one of the things that I realized in the Cyprus case was that the international claim to be making peace, developing a state, and building a kind of economy was a very patronizing, externalized claim, which wasn't based on consent and consensus building, but rather was based on a legitimate form of authority far away from Cyprus and the Cyprus peace process and all of those sorts of things. I also learned that the state is a predatory actor quite often in Cyprus. Coming from Britain, you don't really feel that so much. But people weren't, both states in the Cyprus context were seen to be quite problematic, ethno-nationalist, territorially aggrandizing, and so forth. And finally, I learned that civil society, this great thing that we always talk about, it's worthwhile promoting it and supporting it and so on, can also be embedded in a whole series of patterns of behavior and political practices which are rather negative when it comes to thinking about peace. In this case, ethno-nationalist forms of civil society dominate through the education system into the political party system and into the two governments on the island. But probably the most important thing I learned in that context very early on in my work was that there was also a kind of inversion of power taking place. It was a hidden inversion in the Cyprus context where the internationals controlled the high-level peace process, the state was controlled by long-standing political and business elites, and civil society sort of followed those ethno-nationalist practices and also put claims upon the international for more justice, for territorial changes, and for some kind of constitutional settlement which would reflect not the status quo, but the status quo before the war. But behind all of that, there was something interesting happening. Civil society actors, or rather groups of actors who were connected in the political sphere, in the international sphere, but also in a range of different social contexts, political contexts, economic, cultural, religious contexts in Cyprus, were talking in whispers about the possibilities of peace, about the kinds of reforms that needed to be enacted. They were sanctioned and marginalized and all the rest of it. They were afraid to speak out loud about this because it challenged the international, it challenged the state, and it challenged the long-standing historical narrative about where the Cyprus conflict came from. So what was really interesting for me, and what I realized later on, was that there was this inversion of power taking place where these conversations occurred, and actually they've had some kind of impact. They've been very significant. So that kind of gets me to peace formation and local infrastructures for peace, and I'll try and put it into that context of the sort of inversion of power that we wouldn't expect in a peace process where disputants are probably at their most helpless. Before I go into it, I should warn you that I've been experimenting with PowerPoint recently, and well, it's not going that well, to be honest. The first few PowerPoint presentations I gave, I took heed of the general advice, which is to not have too many slides, not to have too much text, and to try and show some interesting pictures. But unfortunately, I kind of forgot to flick through them as I was speaking. This time, I've decided to reject all that advice, and I've got lots of slides with lots of text and quite a few pictures. But I'm going to try and use it to structure my own talk. So hopefully, I at least won't forget to flick through them. If anybody wants it, you're welcome to have it. Just let me know. So let's start. The peace formation, let's just place this. We're used to talking about state formation. State formation gives us the idea that political forces with material means, often military means and economic means, contest the state. The state is, in the international system, the crucial venue. It's the only real place where you can have material, political, and social power. State is on the international and an eternal claim to a fixed territory controlled by government, exerting influence over a fixed population. This is the classic definition of sovereignty, about what state formation is all about. And most of the literature that we have looks at state formation from a European context. It often maybe looks at parts of Africa, sub-Saharan Africa, in the post-colonial frame. It looks at the Middle East as well, and perhaps parts of Central or Latin America. But often using this kind of European perspective, that what came out of European politics, particularly in the medieval period and after, was a vicious and nasty contestation of the institutions of the state until the top dogs won and entered into a kind of power-sharing arrangement. And this positions the formation argument, the state formation argument, in a negative ontology of peace. What we're saying is that peace is unlikely, it tends to be negative, it's not a high quality peace, citizens aren't really involved in it, it's really just a balance of power, which has been a long-standing argument. It runs from political realism right through to, I think, modern state-building practices today. There's no literature or debate, other than a few references from people like Jean-Paul Liederac and others, about what happens if society or groups within a particular society or context mobilize for peace. Now, we have in different ideological frames understandings of this type of mobilization, non-violent action, revolutionary, counter-revolutionary, non-violent action, and so on. But we don't really have a theoretical, ontological base for understanding this. And yet, if we go to one of the big debates in anthropology recently, it's been about where violence comes from, and particularly where, whether traditional societies are inherently violent, and whether modern societies versus traditional societies tend to enact their politics through violence, with opposing sides of the argument saying that these traditional societies are actually far more peaceful than modern societies. Modern societies have industrialized the means of war, and so forth. Other people saying actually they were much more violent, there was no rule of law, there was no common consensus, and so forth. So what's interesting about the formation argument in political theory, in international relations, and the way it's been used in a range of different regional studies and in peace and conflict studies, is it really is a negative ontology. So what I'm trying to do here is say, well, actually, what are the positive potentials? What can we do about thinking about the social, the local, aimed at forms of positive peace? But again, rather Eurocentric understanding what positive peace is, this sort of social justice plus security, plus human security, and so on. I think we have to start thinking our way out of that too. So this is an inversion of the formation argument. And some of the more positive anthropologists, one of whom will be here on December the 9th, by the way, Douglas Fry will be giving a talk about this, has argued that where societal and political institutions and economic institutions evolve historically towards the means of violence, industrializing the means of violence and using force in order to take control of the state, you also have a counteraction where you tend to have the formation of institutions and law and various forms of social practice which are designed, if you like, to undercut those practices, the roots of conflict, and so forth. And part of the problem is that the means of violence industrialize much more quickly, much more directly, much more materially than the means of peacemaking. So that's kind of the start. And what we've seen quite recently is the formation of these things called local infrastructures for peace. This is the idea, carrying on the idea of peace formation, that you can actually put these into a constitutional framework. And the constitutional framework can be embedded in law and enforced by external action. And I'll come to that later on. So, we come to my first kind of key slide. I think what we can say in general about thinking about peace and development and modernization in international relations and in the international community today is that there's been an increasing connection between the idea of a peace settlement, a peace treaty, a peace process, and this question of what a progressive politics means today. Now, of course, that's a very fraught question. We know that progressive politics were debated throughout the Cold War, for example. There was an outcome which led to this sort of liberal peace, neoliberal state model being the dominant model, and other versions of what it means to have a progressive peace framework, i.e. some kind of social democracy, welfare state, socialism, all those sorts of things, were rejected. But that was a kind of European settlement or a Western settlement. And what we've seen an increasing recognition of, I think, although perhaps superficial, at least in the international institutions, is that in more local contexts, in conflict situations around the world, in different states and different frameworks, this question still arises. And often it's the motivation for conflict. Often it's related to questions of inequality, political, social, economic, or cultural, or in identity terms. Sometimes it's a very material frame. Sometimes it's territorial. Sometimes it's about boundaries. There are questions of social justice and so forth that are actually being raised in the context of a peace process. Now that's something of a contradiction to the modern idea of a peace process. In other words, that which went until the 21st century, which posited that the main point was a ceasefire and some kind of diplomatic high-level agreement in which the fragmented state or the opposed states could come to some accommodation, but only an accommodation which marginally changed the framework of sovereignty and marginally changed the way in which the states operated. So this is a much more invasive understanding, if you like, of how we make peace. It raises this question, what type of peace and what type of state is going to emerge. Now, I would say that basically what we've seen over the last 20 years, from Cambodia to El Salvador, across through the Balkans, Bosnia, Kosovo, across most of sub-Saharan Africa and into various parts of Asia, Southeast Asia, and so on, Cambodia, where we've seen an awful lot of intervention in this vein, where the peace settlement will be followed by a progressive peace, which would be the liberal peace, i.e. the normative framework of liberal peace, human rights and democracy, and the neoliberal state, has really ended up in a dead end. Now, what we tend to see is that this is based on an international understanding of legitimacy. That legitimacy empowers a kind of authority which gathers power and intervenes. And this intervene doesn't really meet with much consensus on the ground. In fact, what we've seen emerging are kind of city-states, authoritarian city-states, where power is concentrated in the capital, often around a pre-existing or more traditional elite who have historically captured power in that context, but in a kind of partial reform syndrome converted it back into something which at least superficially looks like a liberal, democratic, rights-observing state. But really these aren't states of that mould. They perhaps are empty states. States without modern citizens. States that don't connect to the citizens, where their contract is with the international, but not with the social, the population. So this kind of raises the question, how would we think about this progressive form of peace, the positive and emancipatory peace, if we were to fill in those empty spaces, peace formation? So what we see in the end is an internationally backed, and we see this in particular in Afghanistan and Iraq, an internationally backed state framework in which the state is very much denuded of the sorts of powers you would expect it to be able to wield in a post-conflict situation. In other words, the provision of a range of services, the evening out of inequalities, the dealing with a range of identity issues, moderating or at least mitigating territorial claims, building a constitutional framework in representation, in which representation is roughly acceptable or legitimate. Now, I don't say equal, because that's not necessarily what's desired. Instead, what we really seem to be building are these neoliberal states which have very few capacities other than a security capacity, which then are able to embrace global capital, or at least that's the argument, to embrace the global capital that would fly in once the state, be it Iraq or Afghanistan or Bosnia, has stabilized. And then the citizens would begin to realize their citizenship within a human rights, democratic-oriented framework, the liberal peace system. Now, I would say that this has produced a whole range of empty states, states without citizens, states without much control over their territory, states without much security, and so on. And what's really going on is a concern with regional and international security. In other words, the practices of intervention that are developing around these polities, around these conflict-affected societies, or these regional conflict complexes, tend to be aimed at international interests. No surprise there. We shouldn't, I guess, be too surprised about this. And what's most important about the conflict and the state formation argument and the negative ontology that it suggests about the people who live in these places is that all of this legitimates intervention. So in other words, what we're doing is building and reifying a power structure in which intervention is the point, not this positive and emancipatory peace. Now, it kind of raises this question, can the peace that's being imagined be positive and emancipatory if it's only imagined by internationals who are intervening? Or does it have to be imagined by its subjects? So what we see then is a concern with coordination and efficiency. The kind of technology of intervention becomes the point of the peace process and the progressive peace state-building process. And that's why I think an awful lot of the UN, donor, IFI, and also INGO frameworks tend to be thinking about not how the state reflects a social contract, not how the state engages with its citizens, but how these organizations, almost as neo-sovereign actors, can expand their own frameworks of interest on the ground, expand their own, let's say, normative frameworks, their preferences for development, modernization, peacekeeping, peace building, and all of these various ings that have now become very commonplace. So this interventionary practice has now created a whole range of new sovereigns, and they're not the states that are being created. What we hear increasingly being referred to now in the international donor community, in some of the IFIs, and so on, is this idea that there is an international architecture of peace building. And for me, this is perhaps indicative of how peace building, thinking about peace, progressive politics, development, has drifted away from the subject. It has its own inversion going on. The point of peace building, the point of state building, and the point of development is really now something to do with the raison d'etre of the organization itself, which I think is problematic, particularly when we're thinking about a positive peace and so on. Here's a nice photo that somebody in the audience might recognize. It comes from Kosovo. It's one of the UN headquarters. You can see the graffiti over there. So this is something which has been noticed. It's not unnoticed. And in fact, if we look around the literature, and also some of the policy work, by the way, there is an increasing recognition by the international actors who are engaged in these interventionary practices that there's a misinterpretation taking place, that the subject is beginning to understand the intervention, the development process, the program that's being used in ways which contravene the subject, the recipient's sovereignty, autonomy, identity, and aspirations for both a peace and a progressive framework for statehood. So we get this kind of thing. Now, this is just one very isolated example, but there are many, many, many. And indeed, we've seen this whole kind of phenomena of donors being thrown out by governments, of communities rejecting international programs. And one of the things that I remember from my very early work in Cyprus in the bicommunal community was a constant sniping at the motives, the practices, and the power relations that the internationals, in this case often academics, so pretty innocuous people, brought to the table, even in the context of these kinds of social interactions. So these international dimensions are something which we need to be thinking about. One of the other things that you can see from this picture are the very high fences. I mean, we take it for granted, but there's a problem with this. The problem is that if the peace-building development aid industry goes behind walls and bunkers, and even if it doesn't say unfair on the wall, but it says extending the hand of friendship to the Kosovan people for the last 20 years, USAID or UNDP, then straight away, intelligent subjects, I mean the subjects on the ground who are all of them thinking about this process, because for them this is life and death. This is not just what happens today, but it's also the question of how the state looks in the future, will immediately begin to interpret this as an invasion, as an extension of historical power, as a possible practice of colonialism. Now, it doesn't matter whether it is. What matters is how it's interpreted. So what we seem to have in this international framework is an attempt to build legitimate external forms of intervention. And every involvement of the international community has been very careful, I think, to make sure that the right to intervene, the right to program, is not to be questioned by subjects and partners. So a very convoluted sort of framework of arguments has been developed, which is designed to maintain the legitimacy of the international over the legitimacy of the local groups and actors who would, if you like, be having a political debate and contesting it post-conflict in very heated manners. So what we see is the rise of what Timothy Mitchell has called the rule of experts. We have this kind of expert culture, and many of us perhaps are in that. You know, we kind of almost have fallen into that accidentally, perhaps. And the problem with this is we are talking about democracy and human rights and development. We're talking about inequality. We're talking about sustainability, environmental, as well as in terms of the peace. We're talking about appending a progressive peace and state to a peace settlement, and yet somehow we are exercising executive and unaccountable power. Now, when I say we, I'm being extremely broad. I don't mean anybody in this room, but it's a kind of positionality which I think is immediately picked up, for example, when I go to Colombia. It's an immediate assumption, right? And I will really never be able to get beyond that in many ways. So the problem here is, well, what is the problem? The problem is, am I representative of the communities that I'm talking to or of the actors? Is this a power relation of inequality, or is it a discursive framework of partnership? The way much of the international has framed its intervention, the rule of experts, indicates that this is a power relation. The local, the subject, be it the city-state which centers around the capital, whether it's Kabul or Dili, or the suburbs or the rural frameworks, the rural areas, are very much subjects, and they are cajoled into compliant behavior, politically, socially, culturally, economically, as well as religiously, within this political framework. There is no choice, there is no alternative, but the liberal peace, but the neoliberal state. So it's not connected with local power bases. In fact, the whole point of the intervention is to disrupt local power bases, to disrupt local identity, to disrupt the normative framework, to separate church from state, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. All the things that we would draw from our own state formation experiences. It's kind of a problem when we're talking about democracy and human rights. It means that we are prejudging what those mean for others, and I think that's not the point. So the question is, how do we develop a social contract in a framework of the rule of experts? How do we develop this social contract when we don't know much about the context, when we don't know anything about the people? In fact, the people aren't even there. They're not even our partners. And I think this has become, if you like, one of the sort of knotty issues that we've skirted around in the last 20 years that nobody really wants to get to grips with. And I'll talk a bit about that in a sec. Next PowerPoint. Isn't this fun? Okay. So what we have then is a social contract being formed by a kind of external fiat. And as we go through this line of argument that I'm offering you, we start to see a much more colonial type framework for thinking about peace, the state, intervention, why it exists and what it's for and where it's going. It starts to look a little bit like the liberal imperialists' experience in the 1880s, something which the whole framework was developed to avoid, by the way. And I think it's no accident that there have been historians of the UN and international system recently, who've made the argument that even though we tried to have a clean break from colonialism in the mid-1940s and onwards, we didn't really succeed. The inevitability of power relations, of material relations, of normative preferences, of the ideological struggle and the liberal peace system emerging and so forth, has made it extremely difficult for us to step outside of this. And I mean, I can give you numerous examples. I can't remember whether they're coming up on this slide or the next one, so I'll just say them now. I mean, the concept of the field. Now, we use this term, the field. Let's excavate it. What does it mean? The field means this rural space out there where there are a few people, they're backward, they have probably no machinery, they probably haven't had much experience of modernity, and they're probably not concentrated and they can't mobilize. They probably don't have much knowledge, they're not experts. And this is a term which we carry through all of our practices of intervention from the 19th century until today. We still talk about field work, even those who claim we're critical scholars. Now, I think that if you want to cut a very long story short, think about the field as a base of power relations. The reason why we chose that word and not another is because it does indicate all of those things. It automatically legitimates intervention the point of intervention, the state and the international peace-building architecture. Now, I wouldn't have a problem with that if the field had spoken back, if the field had said, yes, we consent. But we have no way, and this is another kind of philosophical problem, we have no way of gaining consent in a crisis situation. But we can do it post-crisis, but we don't. So if we think about that framework, what we're actually now representing is a power structure through peace building, state building, and so forth, in which all local agency is negative. Therefore, the state is at best a way of constraining the negative possibilities of social and political forces inside a state. Then, of course, any intervention to design a state is only going to be about designing a power sharing framework which will be obsessively cautious about security and won't care about the rest. Does that sound familiar? Iraq, Afghanistan, Kosovo, Bosnia, Cambodia, and so on. I mean, I'm exaggerating for effects, but these are the priorities that we see emerging in these sorts of frameworks. So what happens if we ask the partners? Let's change the language from the field, let's talk about partners. The partners of peace on the ground, those people who are going to live with it day to day. What's going to happen? What will they say they need, they think? What will be progressive? What will be positive? What will be emancipatory? And so on. These are questions that we don't really tend to ask. But if we're going to have an inversion and get away from the colonial symbol of the field and to move into something which is perhaps more in keeping with much of the rhetoric of the documentation we have for peace building, development, and state building, then we need to start thinking in these terms, perhaps. Just another quick dig at the state and state building and peace building. Sorry, I couldn't resist this. If you look at the actual data, the data we have from the Human Development Index, and you compare it with the Gini data that we have, which shows inequality, you take this data from the point of settlement in post-conflict states, so whatever date there was a settlement, and then you look at the peace building and state building and development process from that time. Now, obviously, this is often maybe 15 or 20 years now in our context. What we tend to see are very marginal increases in human development, so we can give ourselves a pat on the back, but massive increases in Gini. It raises the question of who is getting the peace dividend. Is it even going to the population? Is it even being, let's say, recycled out of the state that's being built immediately back into the international community? I think this indicates that there's more than one contradiction to the liberal peace, the neoliberal state building framework. So all of this has indicated that what we need to do is go back to the local. And of course, myself and other colleagues have been plugging this for quite a while now. I think, to make it very clear, that if one is to think about democracy as being a terrible thing, but the best thing that's come out of history, even though it's pretty awful because we haven't been able to think of anything better, if we are to take democracy seriously, then of course we do have to always turn to the local. There always has to be some sense of how people construct consensus in communities in view of power relations and material inequalities. In our state building interventions, we don't have that. The local is something which has really annoyed people since we started discussing local agency, and we've been discussing the local turn. And myself and other colleagues, and actually generations of colleagues before us, I think, had the same experience, have found kind of a non-stop, let's say, frosty reception at best, and some very serious annoyance at worst. If you look at these views here, now this is interesting, isn't it? When you go to the UN, let's say you go to political affairs. Okay, so political affairs is high level, it's elitist, they would probably defend the interests of states. This particular person was on the team of a Security Council member. His idea, his concern about turning to the local, I mean, forgive me if I'm slightly perplexed by this statement, because I thought the whole point of peace building, development, modernization, state building was to engage with populations to improve things. We should not expose ourselves to local contexts. We risk our ignorance undermining our legitimacy. In other words, international legitimacy depends on us not engaging with our partners. There's no partnership. This is very clearly a statement of power to the field, to the space out there which is empty and just waiting to be exploited and also modernized. even more surprisingly, in the UN Peacebuilding Commission, how about this? The situation in Haiti can only be resolved by explicit trusteeship. Let's revive the Trusteeship Council. Now, again, there's something going on here. These are people who are talking about peacebuilding and development, who are committed to it, who have probably been trained in it and have probably worked in numerous places around the world. They are so frustrated, both with the system, the international system itself, but also with their engagements with their partners in the field, and the awful things that go on, whether it's war or natural disaster, and state predation and so forth, that the best thing they can come up with is trusteeship, reviving a kind of colonial practice. Again, it's saying a negative ontology of peace exists on the ground. There is no agency, there's no capacity, nothing positive can come out of this type of arrangement. It's really rather negative. A slightly more, let's say, positive, but still not really as far-reaching as we'd like, perspective was from UNDP. The problem's not the local, it's the divided UN system and a lack of political will. In other words, the local's kind of okay, but the real problem is that the UN system doesn't have the will, and it's, the member states, in particular the Security Council, are divided amongst themselves. But what that does is it deflects attention from the local. So again, it's not really an engagement with the local. And here's an amusing one. When I first started trying to get things published, making the claim that it's about time we start to include the practices, cultures, identities, and so forth, and politics of people on the ground in our interventions before they get rid of us and kick us out, this was the response. There's a concern that local agency is represented by the Taliban, Hezbollah, or the LTTE. So in other words, again, this constant affirmation that there's nothing positive to come out of our engagement with context, with the local, with those populations. This is the colonial gaze, looking around the world for extractive possibilities and modernization possibilities. It's quite disappointing, I would say. So, what's going on in the inversion when we go to the local? What's the possibilities? Well, I think that we are very aware in a range of literatures from all over the world that there are different forms of mobilization for peace. And we heard Roger talking about quite a few of these in his talk a couple of weeks ago. And I don't really want to go over the same ground, but I'll certainly reiterate those and add some of my other thoughts. A lot of what's happening is off camera. It's outside of our view. That's because we are trained to think in ways which bring into view the political and economic and social contestation of, let's say, a Eurocentric framework for politics. We are trained not to bring into view what it means to live in an unequal global positionality. We are trained not to understand what it means to mobilize in a small scale and not a large scale, informally, in private, but not in public. We are trained to ignore context. We are trained to accept that the ripping out of our context, that industrialization and large-scale war and so forth has done for us, is simply what populations around the world expect. We are not trained to be sensitive to these sorts of issues. So when we think about the ways in which agency, local agency, speaks back to that kind of power, I call this, by the way, governmental power. This is the kind of power that we exercise. It's partly consensual and partly quite brutal. How do we speak back to that kind of power, or how does the local speak back to that? Well, clearly, when we get involved in a context, a particular situation, let's say it's Afghanistan, we know nothing about the terrain, the social, cultural, religious identity, political terrain. The things that are most visible to us are the acts of violence and the things that are written down on paper. We don't really understand the informal practices which perhaps hold things together, fleetingly perhaps, but have done so at various times. So we're not really trained to see these fragmented, disguised, localized agencies and capacities. We're not really trained to accept that discussions of peace can occur outside of the framework of the liberal state and the liberal peace. So in other words, what we do is we erase local perspectives of what it means to think about peace and replace them with our own. The second we start to talk and think about peace, we sort of erase all the problems which make peace real to the subject. And I think comes back to a question of unequal power relations. So, peace formation, what happens then when we take it seriously? Well, it's very hard to say because we're not really that well positioned to talk about it. But I guess we have many colleagues who are involved in these sorts of debates who have talked about it, and there's a scattering of insights across the literature. We know that networks are important. We know that disguise is important. We know that these things tend to be hidden, because if you bring them out into the open, then the forces of violence will shoot them in the head, effectively. We know that knowledge and networks are very important. We know that knowledge is often contextual. We know that even if that sort of knowledge, the political knowledge, historical evolution isn't written, it's there somehow. We also know it doesn't matter if it's imagined, if it's not even real, if it's not documented in that way. We perhaps also begin to realize it doesn't matter if it doesn't form a state. There are forms of polity outside of the state which are stabilizing. We increasingly know, and I'm thinking back to my Cyprus experience here, that people involved in peace formation who mobilize quietly behind the scenes, who have grand intellectual, let's say, ambitions of resolving things on paper, but realize they have no direct agency other than to keep themselves alive. We also know that their networks extend internationally. So they're transversal networks. They work through power relations, through their own elites, and onto the international stage. And we know that over time these networks tend to increase. We know that the whole point of these sorts of networks is to produce and enhance collaboration and cooperation from every minute space as far as possible, as far as you can go. We know that this type of framework of understanding has been pretty good in keeping itself alive, developing local projects for peace, bringing people together, and eventually connecting with donors and internationals, and then having some influence on the state. So here's a rich web of connections which offers the possibility of survival. It offers some form of public services, even if it's in a kind of shadow state context, as we saw in Kosovo in the 1980s. It prefigures the possibilities of some kind of social and political consensus, as we see in the Cyprus context with the intercommunal negotiations and so forth. The other thing that's very noticeable about the literature on these sorts of networks, the informal social mobilizations that happen in different contexts, whether they're in religious contexts or in labor contexts or in some kind of customary framework of law and authority and so on, is that often women's groups are at the forefront. And this is something which I think is rather unexplored. In fact, the reasons why this type of agency is often quite gendered. So what's coming out of it? If it's real and if it's important, we probably wouldn't expect that in Timor-Leste this is somehow a cogent symbol, something which means something on the Timorese stage. In 1999, when the internationals arrived, Timor was a kingdom. It was a UN kingdom. And these things have been burnt down by the Indonesian occupying forces over the previous 20 or 30 years because these houses, Timorese sacred houses, were sites of resistance. Now, they were sites of resistance during the Indonesian occupation. Before the Indonesian occupation, they were sites of political organization, social and cultural also. In other words, this is where politics happened. This is a sacred house. The ancestors' relics and things like this are stored here. Deaths, funerals, marriages, etc., births are celebrated here. The villagers gather here. Quite often individuals have their own in their back garden, etc., etc. It's quite telling that in Timor-Leste, by about 2006, we started to see a return of these to the landscape. People started to rebuild them. But they weren't involved in any of the state iconography, and they weren't being discussed in any of the formal political channels that had been brought in to the UN Kingdom of Timor-Leste by internationals. Now, at some point, around 2006, there was a lot of violence in Timor-Leste, a lot of social and political unrest. It involved the collapse of the army, riots on the streets, and all these sorts of things. And it seemed the UN, international, World Bank, international donor development consensus that Timor represented the darling of the international state-building process had collapsed. and internationals, if you like, began to reframe their engagement with Timor-Leste away from this idea of Timor being a trusteeship, a UN kingdom, to this possibility that local politics had to determine how institutions and law and so on would be shaped. And one of the things that we saw very rapidly happen was a discussion about what this meant symbolically for the modern state of Timor, a state founded on an anti-colonial struggle, a liberation state, a state in which many of the Timorese people envisioned a place for socialism. None of these things, of course, were acceptable to the UN. So this is a kind of symbolic framework which tells us how hybridity begins to be introduced. And the amusing thing about this is that with all the power of the international community and the resources and the military forces and so on, one wouldn't expect 1.1 million people to really be able to change the nature of the states. But what we see emerging, and in constant discussion now, is the Timorization of this state. To the extent that one local planner, one local policy planner, who, by the way, came through the UN system, a Timorese, he worked in one of the agencies, I think UNDP, for quite a few years, before he then established his own political career inside Timorese institutions. So in other words, he used the international to build up a base in which he could then become a player in the political system. He is now designing a new constitutional framework which reflects the historical identity and culture of Timor, even though it's not been written and there are no historical records. So in a way, this is kind of imagined. But his argument is imagining the ideal state for Timor, which is a blend of hybrid custom, of this kind of socialist, social democracy type framework, a rescue of rights and democracy also from the old customary system. He claims that they had rights and democracy representation in the old customary system. And other qualities like gender relations and so forth, which internationals tend to say were highly unequal. He claims actually in certain communities there were very good examples of what he calls modern practice. So in other words, the state is shifting. And the state is not shifting because the internationals realized any of these things. When I was last in Timor, I went to the UN police and said, what's happening with village security? And they said, well, nothing, because we're not able to really get enough men out into the field and engage with these sorts of things. And I said, well, what about this particular local customary policing system that's been operating for the last 10 years and historically stretches back apparently 300 years? And the UN civilian officer said, actually, we don't know what you're talking about. In other words, they hadn't come across it in all their time there. Even so, perhaps this represents some kind of viable encounter. Another example, which I'll point to here, is the Cyprus example. I talked about that a bit already. But there's a question here about in Cyprus. If these peace formation actors, who are cleverly hiding away, slowly organizing, building the possibilities of some kind of solution and settlement, if they are now popping their head above the parapet, which seems to be the case in Cyprus, what's going to happen? Will it be possible for us to see some kind of move from the hidden spaces, the small-scale frameworks of agency and mobilization, into the public spaces? The bicommunal conflict resolution community in Cyprus is long-standing. It's externally supported, UN and often US universities. It's very, very small, but it has survived. And some of the people who work in it are very well connected, both in the local states, but also in the international community. I mean, there has been, by the way, 50 years of peace talks at the high level between the presidents and the UN Secretary General and his representatives. And nothing has really been resolved. There's no real kind of movement beyond the positions of the 1970s in the Cyprus peace talks. And yet, in this bicommunal, intercommunal debating society, if you like, of perhaps 3,000 people over the last 20 years, more or less every single issue which would connect the possibilities of a peace treaty with a progressive state, which would recognize different identities, different religions, incorporate some readjustments for justice reasons, but also deal with long-standing historical conflicts between the communities over their identity, over the Ottoman Empire, the British Empire, and whether one's identity is Greek and so forth. They've all been resolved. In other words, in that framework, there is already a peace settlement. Now, the question there is, one, Cyprus, both states in Cyprus are liberal democracies. Why hasn't the liberal democracy brought in what seems to be an obviously progressive process with all this potential? And given that they haven't, the answer is probably because they're very ethno-nationalist. What could we do about it? In other words, is there the possibility for us to rethink intervention in order to engage with these types of processes, instead of constantly supporting a high-level official diplomatic political process, which is clearly going nowhere? Now, the political leaders in Cyprus are scared, actually. At a recent meeting, I saw them speak, and one of them said about the intercommunal movement, and this is a valid point, but it's also interesting. He said that you can't go anywhere without the support of the political leaders. In other words, what he's really saying is, actually, you've got somewhere, but to implement this, you need to have material and political power on your side. And that hasn't really happened. So it raises the question of, could we do that better? When we look carefully, and okay, this is where there's a lot of text, so I'll just sum this up very quickly, because that's probably too much to take in. When we look carefully, these kinds of things are happening everywhere. In all of these post-conflict, conflict-affected developmental frameworks, we see different levels of self-organization and self-governance coming from multiple spaces in society. And quite often, they're actually very, very adept at coming to some kind of social level agreement. And the blockages are often at the state or the international level, often around the formal questions of sovereignty, of justice within the sovereign framework, and power sharing. In other words, what we're doing is kind of conceptualizing a mode of peace and politics which is self-defeating. And if we get rid of that, I mean, I know it's impossible, but just as a thought experiment, get rid of it for a sec, we see all of these things happening in the most unlikely places, Somalia, for example, Somaliland, Cambodia, Sierra Leone, Kenya, etc., etc. And what's happening in these places is not just these dead-end conversations between friends over coffee in some safe spots where there's no formal gaze. It's moving into peace infrastructures. So the question is that as they move into the formal practices of state and politics, can the state be reshaped? And this is the project of peace infrastructures, which has become, I guess, rather well known in more recent times, trying to bring out those processes from their hidden spaces and to incorporate them into the state building and peace building process. So external actors are now slowly recognizing the possibility, not least the probability, that local actors, communities, elites, organizations have a stake in their own state and their own peace, and perhaps need to be consulted, and actually are already mobilizing. It raises the same question. Timor suggests that this is a possible practice. In Timor, it's gone as far as producing a formal ministry within the state, a ministry of peace. Cyprus suggests that it might just end up in limbo forever, but become increasingly, although very slowly, accepted. There's something going on here which I think we can look at much more carefully. Let's think about what's missing. Now, these organizations don't have power, they don't have material power, but they have some kind of legitimacy which has enabled them to stay alive and to engage and to push forward. And they are pushing forward in a range of different spaces into the formal states. And where they can't push into the states, they're influencing the international. So from a UNESCO program in the early 1990s to a worldwide UNDP BCPR program, we now have the recognition that if there is to be some kind of engagement with those peace possibility, those peace communities, organizations, mobilizing actors, and so forth, it has to be built into the state that's being formed. The state that's being externally built has to make some space for them. And there's been an argument from South Africa and Nicaragua right through to Nepal quite recently about creating a formal space, official practices, a minister, and so on within the political architecture of a state to represent these communities. Well, of course, it's not all good. What we tend to see in this sort of practice emerging are a range of new contradictions. So I'm not really trying to argue that peace formation and its extension into new local infrastructures in the modern state is a panacea. I'm arguing that it's essential, but it's not a panacea. Because what we tend to see in that are new power struggles, new forms of struggle. Where informal rule moves into the state, formal rule may try to repulse it. So this kind of thing becomes problematic, where you see, let's say, customary rule, customary frameworks for law and political practice at the decentralized level being moved up to the parliament, for example. Then you see a contestation of political power in the parliamentary framework. And we don't really know how that's going to go. But it does suggest that there's potential there, but it is untried and untested. Because what we're doing is we're taking very localized patterns of politics and power and putting them into a modern, let's say, industrial power setting, the modern state. In some places we see that this seems to be a genuine attempt, like in Timor, to localize the state, to make it look Timorese, to make the populations move into this modern state, to make them feel part of it. In other places like Nepal, we've seen these local infrastructures immediately being hijacked by existing, if you like, power structures within the state. And it's suggestive of a particular problem, which is that this type of agency cannot countermand the kind of power that the state, the modern political economy, wields. But that kind of power can be countermanded by intervention. So in other words, if we start to rethink intervention in that framework, it has a mission. Of course, the problem with that argument is also that interveners do not like to support social, cultural, economic practices, as well as political practices, which are different to the ones they imagine the liberal peace system to represent. So different normative systems, let's say outside of liberalism, different economic systems, God forbid socialism, different social practices, let's say communal forms, and cultural identities which are also not within this kind of framework of the modern state, are endlessly, and gender is also, I think, a very important problem here as well. These are endlessly brought up as reasons why we cannot engage with the local. Even though we know the local is already engaging with us, it's already mobilizing, and it's actually starting to slowly move into the state, into these new states that are emerging, and occupy them. So is this the missing link for policy? Well, in these recent reports, the UN Secretary General report on peace building after conflict, the World Bank Development Report of 2011, the New Deal, all of these documents show that the internationals are starting to engage, that internationals have recognized that they can't get anywhere without some kind of partnership, that intervention isn't enough. And so now begins the painful task, the slow and painstaking task of reconstructing what it means to form peace in context, what it means to encounter that when you intervene with your program or development mission or peacekeeping mission, and how you maintain legitimacy in all of that process. And I think if you think about it in terms of the last 20 or so years, we see a very high level of intervention, a very high level of legitimacy for intervention in the early 1990s, quickly dissipating around the time of Rwanda and Bosnia, and then dropping off the scale by the time we get to Iraq and Afghanistan. And this, let's say, policy response is an attempt to restore that intervention to the international. But this is a new type of intervention. This is an intervention which is now cognizant of the local, and the possibilities that there are different ontologies, different ontological possibilities in local contexts which are formative of the state just as much as their intervention is. So, almost there. What does this mean for an emancipatory peace? Well, it means that the idea of connecting a peace process to the contestation of what progressive politics is in a particular context is probably a good idea. It means that these adjustments of policy also make sense. It means that it is inevitable that internationals will accept the possibility of hybrid states, hybrid peace. There will inevitably be normative clashes over ideology, clashes over how identity is arranged, clashes over individualism versus communalism, and so on. All of these things are inevitably part of the politics of intervention and the politics of the resistance to that intervention. i.e. peace formation. I think it also suggests that the power structure of the field is finished, and that's increasingly been recognised. We've seen various goes at this in policy practice. Talk about empowerment, for example, was an earlier attempt to do this. But there is a shift away from thinking about intervention as a legitimate international practice because of human rights abuses, because of a democratic deficit, because of war, because of all of those sorts of things, to a discussion about how we enable responses to these sorts of problems on the ground. In other words, how do we draw out what's there? How do we draw out the potential and the capacities that are there, while also respecting what's currently in place, what exists? And I think this is going to throw up a whole can of worms, but it suggests that international actors have to think about legitimacy in local terms. They have to think about intervention in local terms. Development, modernization, all of these practices have to be localized, but not by the internationals, by the recipients. The subjects have to invert their relationship with internationals. Perhaps the best thing that internationals could be thinking about is, in the context of this peace formation and the local infrastructures that are emerging, is how to enable them and what kind of power structures are opposing them, how these may be, if you like, mitigated, and how these new power structures that peace formation will represent inevitably will fit into the international. Now, I think this offers the possibility of a much more sophisticated understanding of peace building, state building, development, conflict resolution, conflict transformation, all of these things, these milestones that have marked the literature, the policy literature, and the theoretical literature in the last 20 years or so. So just finally, in response to those quotations that I showed you earlier from some of my field subjects in New York, I think we have to make a few assertions in the light of this evidence, which are probabilities. Peace, the social contract, these sorts of things, legitimacy, they come into being in local contexts. They can't be supplanted by international legitimacy, by international models of peace. There's an encounter going on, but they have to be grounded. And I think the story of intervention over the last 20 years suggests that there's no point intervening if you don't have partners on the ground who have some kind of capacity to raise consensus and to direct what you do. Trusteeship is a contradiction of this. There's no going back to trusteeship, despite the romantic vision of some people in the international system who think it's the only way. If we are to think about efficiency and coordination, these two buzzwords of international agency for intervention, it has to be localized. We have to think about what it means in local terms. And that involves a completely different skill set to the one that many internationals have, I'm afraid. It's possibly quite a radical statement. A lack of international political will and division undermines local peace processes. It doesn't undermine international intervention. Again, a change in mentality. There's far more to local agency than violence. The common assumption is that the only thing that comes out of the local space is violence, the dominant thing that we see and that we engage with, and therefore that negates all responsibility to engage sensitively, to respect the local polity, whatever it might be. And yet, as we've seen in my examples and many others, this kind of local agency is always mobilizing. And it's not mobilizing violently. It's not necessarily mobilizing for the revolution. It's mobilizing, in some quarters at least, for peace. There are possibilities there, if we can identify that. This operates in a very different temporal scale. It doesn't operate in the industrial modernity of modern diplomacy. And this is something that we need to consider too. There are different time zones, if you like, in peacemaking, particularly in the context of how the state is emerging in different spaces, with different implications for development, for the kinds of goals that development processes might be interested in, as well as for the design of constitutions and law and so forth. Basically, all of this type of engagement is necessary if there is actually to be legitimate authority, both on the ground and internationally. You can't have a state which is built from the outside, which makes sense to its citizens. So, in sum, that's my final slide. And fortunately, we managed to get through all of them without going too far over time. So I'll finish there. Thank you.